director for Common Knowledge Trust. We're a New Zealand NGO, and we house the Birthing Better childbirth skills that hundreds of fathers and mothers developed in the early 1970s with me. And when I came to New Zealand in the mid-1990s, I put all those skills into a not-for-profit. This series is dedicated to Nicette at the VBAC Education Project. She's just dedicated her life to giving you information about vaginal births after cesarean. When these skills started to develop in the early 1970s in the United States, there was only a 4.5% cesarean rate. So fathers and mothers who developed these skills were not developing skills to try to prevent an initial cesarean or to have a vaginal birth after a cesarean. That came more towards the early 1980s. But today, in part two, what I'm going to discuss is the second childbirth trend. So I first gave birth in 1970, and I gave birth in a very unique childbirth trend. It was when there was an extremely high societal expectation that all families become skilled to birth their baby. Although it was based on Lamaze and the Bradley method, and those two obstetricians were very much focused on skills being used to achieve three goals: natural birth, pain-free labor, with no medical intervention. However, these were the first childbirth preparation classes, and they were taught all over the United States and probably in Canada as well. In New Zealand, that wasn't the same. It was Grantley Dick Reed, Childbirth Without Fear. It was taught in the early 1950s through the 1970s, but only to low-risk pregnant women who doctors believe would have a low-risk birth. In fact, those three obstetricians, that was their goal. And that did create the first oppositional approach to childbirth and what eventually has become the mummy wars of childbirth. We cannot split low risks from high risk. We cannot split 100% of pregnant women and divide them into small little groups. 100% of us are going to give birth. So from the 50s into the mid-70s in the United States, there was an extremely high societal expectation that everybody could take a childbirth preparation class, and that was Lamaze, or you paid to go to a Bradley class. We used those skills, but it turns out they were really techniques. They didn't adjust well, they didn't adapt well, and they certainly weren't sustainable. And many people didn't use them if they were high risk, or stopped using them if they had more medical care. And so what happened after a generation of a very high societal expectation that everyone should become skilled is that the next group of birth advocates, and those were the ones that rose up as I was developing these skills with families, and they began to take a look at the skills in relationship to the goals. So had those skills achieved those three goals: normal birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions? And there was sort of a collective decision among that group of birth advocates who really wanted not to see birth being medicalized, and we could understand that. It's a complicated story. However, they were talking about us, not the delivery of service. So they were talking about us. And the reality is that they sort of decided that skills didn't achieve those births. And as I said in the last talk, it was a mistake that those three obstetricians didn't just say 100% of pregnant women will give birth, 100% of pregnant women should become skilled, because the next generation, had that happened, we wouldn't have that conversation because the goals wouldn't be so narrow. They would basically be very broad goals that said if you use skills throughout the activity of birthing your baby, you're going to cope and manage, work through, deal with, handle, stay on top of, and feel more in control. And that's a good enough goal, really, to tell you the truth. Now, can we do more with a goal? Yes, we can on an individual basis, but for a societal basis, that's a pretty good goal. It's that 100% of pregnant women who are skilled and who use skills will feel more empowered by using skills. So when the new birth advocates came along, and I gave birth in 1970, and the last birth I had was in 1982. So I lived through that change, and I birthed through that change. So I used Lamaze, I didn't feel the skills worked particularly. I didn't get involved in this because of that, but I could tell right away that they weren't effective. I was also a body worker, working with people with bad backs, often people my age who had damaged their body in birth and had lifelong issues like peeing every time they coughed or ran or laughed or jumped, or pain having sex or sore tailbones. So when the birth advocates in the 1970s started to say that skills don't achieve those goals, we need women to have choices, something really profoundly changed. First of all, the skills focused on, from the 50s to the 70s, on these low-risk normal pregnancies and births. And what that started to do was to divide women. There is no division between high risk and low risk. We're all pregnant and we're all giving birth, and the birth of our baby is important. And also, without real intent, Lamaze, Bradley, and Grantley decreed, we're beginning to the voice of being anti-medical. The birth advocates that arose in the 1970s were starkly anti-medical. Choices were not about what type of medical care you had. It was what medical care you didn't want. And when I gave birth in 1970, we had assessments, monitoring, and procedures. The natural birth advocates of the 1970s lumped all of those into the word interventions, with a very strong implication, even today, that interventions are imposed on women and unnecessary, rather than seeing them as assessments, monitoring, and procedures, which we may not like and which we may not want. However, if we take those things away outside of our modern healthcare system, then we are saying, do we want to actually give birth when there is no assessments, monitoring, procedures, as still experienced in women who have no access to medical care around the world? And those women would like the assessments, monitoring, and procedures. So when the belief was that skills would achieve a birth without those interventions, and women didn't achieve that, then somehow in the mind, skills were not essential. In fact, they were actively dismissed. We often hear the phrase, cows and cats aren't taught to birth, women don't need to birth. It became an insult to believe that women needed to be taught how to breathe, partly because the breathing techniques of Lamaze and Bradley were so artificial that they couldn't be maintained. The idea that a father would coach was dismissed, that you don't want fathers sitting on the sideline going, push, push, push. They should support women's choices. Well, that takes skills away from fathers, and those fathers are going to be the ones who are going to be in the child's life. So when skills were dismissed and replaced by choices, that was what I saw in the families that I worked with who developed the Birthing Better skills. We saw that as the second mistake. Had the first mistake not been made, had 100% of pregnant women in the 50s been told, learn some skills and use them, the generation, my generation, would have come into birth saying, we need some skills. And skills would have naturally then evolved and gotten better and more effective, which Birthing Better is, because that's what families wanted. They wanted better skills. So when choices came in, the idea was that women should investigate the pros and cons of interventions. So childbirth preparation changed from being skills-based to information-based, and skills were basically pretty much deleted. As I said in the first video, when we were all skilled in the 1970s, that meant multiple millions of us went into the hospital, basically, and the labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians saw multiple millions of women doing their best to use some skills and fathers doing their best to help them. That changed how the medical profession saw childbirth. And it was during that period between the 70s and the 80s that the assessments, monitoring procedures that I had began to be relaxed and changed. Women today are no longer shaved. They're no longer given an enema. They can eat, they can drink, they can move around, they can have early discharge. They can hold the baby can be in the room with them, they are encouraged to breastfeed, they can even get into water in some places. That didn't exist when I gave birth in 1970. But it was because of what we did that allowed that change to occur. And because the birth advocates who said skills don't work, women just need choices and information, that meant that from the end of the 1970s onward to today, fewer and fewer women and men are going into birth skilled. Now, our NGO, our charitable trust, asks everybody, we talk to everybody for the past 50 years. We know that in the 50s and the 70s, birth providers in the hospitals saw about 8 out of 10 women and men using some form of skill. They didn't always feel that those skills were going to achieve that normal birth, but that was the wrong goals. If they had just said skills are going to help you cope and manage better, then yes, the medical profession would have said, yes, we see that happening. But it was that it was connected to those specific narrow goals that the medical profession got antsy about, and they were right to get antsy about it. So when we were birthing with skills and they saw us being skilled, they relaxed and they changed the childbirth trend. Now, birth professionals tell our trust that they see less than 1 in 20 women being skilled, and maybe that many men helping. Men are being hung on, they're there, but they don't know what to do. They're been told just to support women's choices. That doesn't really give them action, certainly doesn't give them skills. So from the 70s to the present, the focus has been exclusively on choices or the lack of choices. So birthing better families that develop the skills lived through that change. We developed skills that were an evolution. They didn't come from Lamaze or Bradley. We evolved a set of skills that are uniquely different, but include a better understanding of how we develop good breathing patterns, good touch relaxation, good communication. And then, as the cesarean rate started to rise, because we demanded not to have a scar on our belly, and we were wearing bikinis, so the medical profession came up with a bikini cut, and so the cesareans became safer. And so we then, as people who were developing these skills, started to develop skills that would reduce the incidence of long first and second stages, which tended to be the non-medical reasons why we ended up with more interventions. Because, as mentioned in the earlier part, when the cesarean rate was only 4.5%, that meant we all labored, and we could labor for days, and that was considered normal. Today, that isn't what you want. Women do not want to labor for 24, 36, 48, 72 hours. It's exhausting, and women feel way out of control. So when the choice-based trend came in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, these two huge mistakes married. The first mistake was that skills were targeted to a group of women that were perceived as low risk. And I want to discuss that for a minute. If you put 1,000 childbearing women who are not pregnant in a room, how many of them have health issues? Lots, right? So lots of women go into pregnancy with health issues. If you put those same 1,000 women in a room who are now pregnant, those health issues may or may not impact them, but new ones can arrive, or old ones can go away. If those same 1,000 women are all birthing, then there are more issues that can involve both the baby and the mother. So this idea that low risk and normal means that there aren't health issues has always been inaccurate. We bring health issues into our pregnancy and into our birth that may or may not impact it. But as mentioned in the last one, regardless of the risk factors, you can have multiple risk factors, and regardless of where you birth, that nothing has to do with how fast a baby gets out of your body or how well you cope. So when the choice-based system really became very strong and it became a global conversation and a very strong group of birth advocates, then what happened was that women began to spend an infinite amount of time doing research. And it was also at a time where more women were going back into the workplace. So things were beginning to change within families as well. The family structure was changing. When we pulled away from skills, that was the first mistake. Not having skills for everybody, not seeing a goal as that is adequate to have just women feel more empowered and cope better. And then when they pulled skills away from choice in the 1980s, and choice was set up to be say no to medical care, then the reality is birth professionals saw fewer and fewer skilled women with higher and higher demands. And they didn't know how to meet those demands. Because the reality is, if they're seeing a woman not cope well, but she wants X, Y, and Z, as health professionals that know that maternity care focused on risks and focused on reducing suffering, the care providers who attend women who look out of control because they lack skills have a great deal of difficulty supporting the choices that are quite anti-medical. And you can understand that as a person. If you are seeing somebody saying, I don't want this or I want that, and their behavior is stressed, overwhelmed, out of control, it is hard to believe that they are thinking clearly. So it's really important for you to understand that you now, in 2020, are living the results of those two terrible mistakes that were made. Skills should have been for everybody without exception, all pregnant women without exception. The goal should have been to cope and manage better with all births without exception. And fathers should have skills to help the women cope without exception. The choices are fine to couple with skills, as long as you recognize that choices are what you want, you don't want. And they can be variable. And you're not always certain what you want until hindsight. But skills are what you use. It's what you do to do the activity of birthing your baby. So had choices and skills partnered, skills would have continued to evolve, just as birthing better skills have evolved. And that's why now, 50 years later, I have decided as the director of Common Knowledge Trust that it's important to speak out. We can prevent initial VBAC, we can prevent initial cesareans when those are coming from those long delayed first and second stages. And also when there are risks, because a risk is only an issue. It doesn't become a problem unless it begins to exhibit problems. So if we prepare our body for childbirth to create space and open up for our baby and then cope and manage well, we can negotiate better with care providers because they see us coping and managing better. And if the risks aren't presenting as a problem, they're more likely to negotiate. So we can also achieve more vaginal births after cesareans because for whatever reason you had a cesarean, when you prepare your body for birth and learn how to open up and create space for your baby, and when you learn to cope and manage through the hard work of labor, you're more likely to get to the vaginal part. And labor is hard work. So this is part 2, and this is the 1970 to the present. And the next one is going to be the implications of what these mistakes caused you to have in the now. See you again.